My wife disappeared 15 years ago. Today, she called me out of the blue. I don't like to talk about what happened 15 years ago. I don't even like to think about the fact that on January 7, 2008, Sarah Collins, beloved member of the community, left home to run an errand and was then never seen again. It was a huge case back then. Everyone seemed to want to know what happened to her, but no one was more desperate for answers than I was. Sarah and I had been married for 5 years. I knew as soon as I met her that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. She had one of those smiles that just lit up a room. That's why it was so hard to believe that such a beautiful, successful woman had seemingly disappeared. They hadn't even recovered her body. 15 years later and they still didn't have a shred of evidence. Not a tire track, or even a fingerprint. Nothing. The police put out an appeal, but no one came forward. Somehow, not a single person had seen her. It was like she had just vanished without a trace. I think about Sarah a lot. I could never quite bring myself to take down the photos of her from around the house. Sarah's bright face still smiles down at me from every room. There's one photo of her, from our wedding day, that I really love. Looking at it is like looking straight at her. It captured her perfectly. 2 days ago, I found myself staring at it, really getting lost in the details. Her eyes, the way the corners of her mouth were lifting into a smile, the small dimple on her left cheek. I was looking at it so intently that I almost didn't notice the phone ringing. It was the landline phone, which was odd, as no one ever called me on the landline anymore. It was all mobiles nowadays. When I looked at the caller ID, it was an unknown number. I shrugged, and picked it up anyway. It was probably just the bank, calling to confirm something. The call took a moment to connect, but when it did, I heard a strange rustling sound on the other end of the line. Hello? I wasn't in the mood for any prank callers. Is anyone there? Hello? Daniel? Daniel, thank goodness I finally reached you. The voice on the other end of the line was a woman's voice, shaking and breathless. Daniel, it's me. It's Sarah. Are you there? When I heard her name, it was like my heart had stopped beating for a moment. Sarah. My Sarah. But that was impossible. Sarah had gone missing 15 years ago. Whoever this was, it was not my wife. I don't know who you are, but you're not Sarah, I hissed into the phone, coldly. Stop calling this number. I had dealt with a lot of these calls, especially when Sarah first went missing. Con artists, fraudsters, anyone who wanted to manipulate a grieving husband. I knew none of them were my wife. No, Daniel, wait, you have to listen to me. It's me. Sarah. You have to believe me. She was sounding shrill and desperate now, even a little hysterical. The lengths that people go to in order to sell a lie is astonishing. Why are you doing this? I asked, angrily. It's been 15 years since my wife disappeared. What do you want from me? For a moment, the woman on the other end of the line didn't respond. I was beginning to think that the call had disconnected, when she finally spoke. Daniel, please. It's me. It's your wife, Sarah, the woman begged. I'm telling the truth. It's me, she continued to plead, but I'd had enough. I wasn't going to listen to this liar anymore. Don't call this number again, I firmly told her, hanging up. I thought that would do it. She wouldn't be likely to call me again. I assumed it was all over. The next day, I had asked a friend to help me repair my plumbing system. He was a good friend, I'd known him since college. He had been there for me when Sarah disappeared, getting me through it. We were both taking a break, catching up on the important events in each other's lives, when my landline phone began to ring again. Sorry, I have to take this. It might be important, I said, getting up from my seat and making my way to the phone. I noticed that the call was coming from an unknown number, just as it had the day before. I didn't make a connection right away. After all, it could have just been the bank this time around. I picked up the phone, and I heard the same rustling sound. It was unsettling, in a strange way. I almost felt like I'd heard it before. I just couldn't put my finger on it. Hello? I was already beginning to get a good idea of what this call was, and I wasn't happy about it. I told you not to call this number. Daniel? Daniel, thank goodness I finally reached you. The very same words that she had said the day before. Daniel, it's me. It's Sarah. Are you there? It was undoubtedly the same woman. I don't have the time for this, I hissed into the phone. I know you're not Sarah. Stop calling me. I hung up the call and walked back to my friend, who looked confused. Who was that? He asked me. I heard you saying Sarah's name. Is everything okay? It was some prank caller, trying to pretend to be Sarah, I told him, rolling my eyes. I thought that I had left it all behind. I even changed my phone number. I don't know how this woman got hold of my new one. Pretending to be Sarah? My friend echoed. That's really strange. Did you tell anyone about it, like the police? No. I shake my head. There's no need. It's just someone trying to cause a bit of drama. They probably want money, or something like that. I made it clear that was the end of the conversation. I didn't want to continue talking about it, bringing up harmful reminders of the past. I woke up the next day, not expecting to get any more calls from the unknown number. I made it very clear that I wouldn't be participating in her charade. However, I was quickly proven wrong. As soon as I started to walk downstairs for a glass of water, the phone rang again. I thought about letting it ring, but I had a better idea. I was going to issue a much stronger warning to the caller, even threatened to get the police involved if the calls wouldn't stop. That would scare her, I was certain of it. I picked up the phone, hearing the very same eerie rustling. I couldn't explain it, but it made a shiver run up my spine. Finally, the call connected. It was just the same as the other times, the same pathetic monologue. Daniel? Daniel, thank goodness I finally reached you. Maybe it was even a recorded message. Daniel, it's me. It's Sarah. Are you there? If you don't stop calling this number, I'll have no choice but to involve the police, I told the caller. This is harassment. If you want money, try conning someone else. Before I could even give the woman on the other line a chance to answer, I hung up the call. Hopefully this would show her that she wouldn't be manipulating me. I could see right through her elaborate scam. I was sure that my warning would stop the calls coming in. I was so sure of myself that when I was woken by a loud, persistent ringing sound the next morning, I didn't even think to connect it to the unknown number calls. I first assumed it was my alarm, waking me up, but when I turned to look, I saw that the alarm hadn't gone off yet. That was when I reached the conclusion that it was the landline phone. I rushed down the stairs, wanting to tell the caller that I would be taking police action, wanting to catch out the desperate scammer. Fortunately, I got down there in time, and picked up the phone. Holding it to my ear, I heard that creepy rustling that I had become familiar with. It still made my heart beat faster, just for the few seconds until the call connected. Daniel? Daniel, thank goodness I finally reached you. The usual message of hysteria came through the phone. I was well used to hearing it by now. Daniel, it's me. It's Sarah. Are you there? I gave you a warning. I said that if you called again, I would be taking legal action. I spoke into the phone, loudly so that whoever was on the other side would be sure to hear me. You've gone too far now. I have to do something about this. I waited for the woman to respond. Daniel? No, it's me. I'm not lying to you. I would never lie to you. Daniel, it's me, Sarah. Your wife, it's me. I can't stand the high-pitched whine of her voice. You're not Sarah, I told her, bitterly. I know you're not Sarah. I will be taking action. Goodbye. I hung up the call for the final time and placed the phone back. I know that woman wasn't Sarah. I know for a fact she wasn't. I know it, because, on January 7, 2008, Sarah Collins, beloved member of the community, was killed. And I was the one who killed her. Sarah was an incredibly beautiful woman. I couldn't believe my luck when she first started showing interest in me. I didn't exactly have a lot of experience when talking to women, and I was ecstatic that someone like Sarah had chosen someone like me. I loved her, for every single second of our marriage. I loved her, even when I found out that she was cheating on me. I had accidentally stumbled across a string of romantic messages between Sarah and one of her co-workers. She was planning to leave me for him. Sarah, my Sarah, was planning to leave me for him. I couldn't have that. She was so beautiful, so bright, so full of life. I couldn't lose her. I just couldn't lose her. So I killed her. I didn't have to think about it for long. It was the only way that she would be mine, only mine forever. If she was dead, she would never leave me. She would always be my Sarah. When the police arrived, I made up an elaborate lie that she had gone out to run an errand and never come home. That very same lie ended up on headlines of the national news. I didn't know if I would even get away with it, but a year passed, and then another year, and then another. 15 years passed, and no one ever saw through me. I was about to walk back upstairs, when I heard a small tapping at the window. Click. Click. That was the sound of the window opening, and that's when I heard it. Rustling, right here in my own house. Rustling that paralyzed me with fear and sent my mind into a state of panic. Then I heard her. Daniel? Daniel, thank goodness I finally reached you. The voice was coming from inside the house now. Daniel, it's me. It's Sarah. Are you there? I'm a world-famous Michelin star chef. Today's course is humans. I inhaled slowly, relishing the sharp, sweet scent of the fresh tomato sauce as I spread it. Though my touch was delicate and my movement precise, I couldn't keep the swatches of bone-white dough from materializing in the ladle's wake. But that was easy to correct. Measuring the sauce by eye, I painted over each ghostly trail as an artist corrected imperfections on the canvas. Underappreciated as it was, cooking was still as much an art form as sculpting marble, or painting the ceiling of a chapel. The patience, skill, dedication, and raw talent necessary to combine the ingredients that inspired me into masterpieces of cuisine were no less than those of any Renaissance master applying themselves to their art. And if cooking was an art, then I was, without question, the Michelangelo of cuisine. Tonight had been years in the making. The recipe was elegant in its simplicity, but the ingredients to do my masterpiece justice had taken time to procure and prepare. Shopping for the meat had been the hardest part. Nothing found in a supermarket would do, and though the farmer's market had more organic options, it was often too crowded to judge the quality. I had a sixth sense when it came to knowing which animal would prove worthy of my efforts. It was all in the eyes. A glance at the right eyes and electricity would hum through every nerve, arousing all my senses at once. It was all I needed to know I had found what I was searching for, and not 2 months back I had finally found them. I had felt the blood quicken in my veins when I spied her alone. The distended girth of her belly had filled me with awe and a tentative joy, but it was when I had discovered that she was but one half of a bonded and breeding pair that my considerable, though already quivering self-control was pushed to its limits. It had been a difficult acquisition, but they were mine now, my own little budding family. I had never had a family before, and though I found myself enjoying the changes inherent in raising my new stock with affection, I quickly discovered it made the matter of selecting parts to harvest delicate. Now, I'm no fan of slaughter, so if I can harvest without killing, I will do so, and normally the selection process allows for a variety of cuts to be had without killing the stock. However, my beautiful pair were fickle. It seemed few of the available cuts would leave them in a state still willing to breed together. I was gentle in my treatment of them, but firm, and eventually I had settled on a portion of leg from each. You may think me callous in this venture, harvesting without slaughtering, taking the meat and organs, yet keeping them alive. But I assure you, I hold my stock in the highest regard and tend to their every need, personally. Their quality of life does not lack for the parts I take, and I cherish them dearly, even after they have finally contributed their last. Happily, my careful selection meant many more to come, and I rewarded them generously for their sacrifices. Shortly after I had procured the leg cuts, fatty from him, and lean from her, I had cubed and ground both cuts to the dulcet strains of Mozart's La Si Darem La Mano, occasionally humming along with Don Giovanni as the marbled pink tendril slithered from the grinder's narrow slots, and blended it by hand into a mixture of cracked anise, sea salt, wine, paprika, a dash of sugar, and, of course, pepper, black and cayenne. After the spices had a chance to really saturate the meat, I passed them through the grinder again, bloating the taut casing gathered at the end of the whole plate until several links of glistening sausage were laid out before me. 8 agonizing weeks later, the meat was cured enough to be painstakingly sliced into the rich burgundy medallions that would adorn my masterpiece. They smelled of the wine, fennel, and garlic I had used to season them, but there was a more subtle scent beneath the spice, a scent that was unique to my little family, a scent that made my mouth water in anticipation of the flavors that would unfurl upon my eager tongue. On a blanket of fresh mozzarella made from the female's own milk, which was made not an hour before I set about building my masterpiece for the freshest possible taste. I arranged the medallions of pepperoni in concentric rings and finished with a garnish of more cheese, grating it directly onto my creation. I felt the burning anticipation rake its hungry nails down my back. With a delicious shiver, as well as delicacy and deliberation, I slid my masterpiece into the simple brick oven built into the kitchen's southernmost wall, to be lovingly toasted by a fragrant applewood fire. Hands washed and apron retired upon the glinting stainless steel of a meat hook by the door, I joined the only member of my new family willing to behave at the dining table. Standing beside my seat, I gently enfolded the wine glass within slender, delicate fingers, the fingers of an artist, and smiled a dreamy smile. I hoped the pleasure welling within me might infect her and help to ease the admittedly rocky transition she'd so far experienced in her new home. "You're going to love this," I said, leaning over to pour wine into her waiting glass, and sweeping a hand down my chest to keep the plum silk of my tie from falling into my own. I gave the bottle a little twist to stop the crimson flow, and set it on the table with a dismayed cluck of the tongue as I finally saw the state of her. I had been so careful when applying her makeup, and was not pleased to see tears staining her beautiful cheeks with dark streaks of ruined mascara. All smiles forgotten, I moved to her side and opened the carefully folded napkin from her plate with careless flourish and a loud snap. "Really, Samantha," I said, dabbing at her cheeks like a mother hen. "If you're not going to keep yourself presentable at the dinner table, then you'll spend the evening in the pen with your husband." Those bright blue eyes, those special electric blue eyes I loved so much, widened in fear at the mere mention of the pen. I gave a quiet hum of affirmation. Gripping her chin, I turned her head this way and that, looking for any blemishes I might have missed. When I was finally satisfied she was finished with her unsightly tears, I returned to the kitchen to fetch her a new napkin. The kitchen was redolent with the scent of cooking flesh and baking dough. My smile returned. I made quick work of turning a clean square of starched white cloth into the remarkable likeness of a swan before I strolled back into the dining room to place it upon her plate with the swan's head facing her. Once I had seated myself across from her, I sipped the dark red wine and closed my eyes in delight. Though tonight's meal was, without a doubt, my most inspired use of ingredients, devising a way to properly ferment a truly sanguine wine had been my most ingenious, an undertaking of many years, I had finally created a vintage worthy of complimenting the masterpieces I crafted in the kitchen. I opened my eyes, gazing across the short distance between us to appreciate her loveliness, before raising my glass in giddy invitation. "Drink up, Samantha." I all but giggled. "Prime your palate, or you won't be able to truly appreciate the complexities of tonight's entree, and I can't even begin to tell you what a shame that would be." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but I was pleased to see they didn't fall as she lifted a shaking hand to the wine glass before her. I didn't even mind the rattling her chain made as it slid across the table behind her wrist. I smiled a little more as I tipped my glass in toast. "To new beginnings, and happy meals." I winked. Her hand faltered. Precious crimson stained the heirloom lace and pristine linen dressing the table. "Samantha," I sighed, and shook my head. Her lip trembled as she fought back the tears. I rose, reluctantly, and crossed to her with all the silent disapproval of a parent forced to punish their child. I gently wrapped my arm around her torso, lifting her from the chair and releasing the chain securing her in the same fluid motion. "Please," she whispered as I set her on her good leg. "You know the rules, Samantha," I chided, disapproval darkening my tone. "If I compromise them for you, I'll have to compromise them for the whole family, and I just can't have that kind of disrespect at my table." A small wail came from upstairs and we both looked up, I with interest, and she, it seemed, with fear. I paused to listen and think. Then the baby wailed again. I suppose there would be no helping it. "It looks like I'll be needing you tonight after all," I said as I led her to the stairs, the stump of her left leg dangling uselessly between us. I set her in the chair lift against the wall and leaned back to give her a stern looking over. "You see to the baby, Samantha, and you can stay inside tonight." I tipped her forehead to my lips and placed a parental kiss on her brow just as the timer in the kitchen chimed. "Pizza's ready," I sang, and patted the place where her knee should have been. I pressed the button that would activate the seat's rail mechanisms and beamed as I watched her slowly ascend. She was such a perfect creature, truly. Plump in all the places I valued most. A shiver of unbridled anticipation stole my breath a moment before I turned from her and waltzed to the kitchen to free my creation from the fire that could so easily destroy what it had helped create. The disappointment I felt at being forced to enjoy such a masterpiece as I had labored to bring to life over the last 2 months was not enough to dampen my mood, however. After all, with such perfect ingredients, this was destined to be the most delectable meal I'd ever made. Nothing could detract from my enjoyment. Once I had taken my seat at the table, a perfect slice of the perfect meal displayed upon my plate, I swirled the wine still staining my glass, which released the deeper scents trapped within. Oak, vanilla, tobacco, the sinfully sharp essence of copper. I inhaled deeply of its heady bouquet before teasing myself with a final, restrained sip. It was just enough to color my tongue with its rich, sanguine essence. This was it. The moment had finally arrived. I was ready. Bon appetit, I whispered, reverently lifting the pizza to my eager lips as I closed my eyes in anticipation of the delights to come. An exquisite melange of flavor exploded across my questing tongue. It was everything I had hoped, everything the rich, complex fragrance had promised, and so much more. I sighed around the perfection of that first bite as something in my soul settled into place, like a crooked cog finally clicking into alignment as precision clockwork whirred into motion. I was made whole with that single, perfect bite. 2. With that bite, I was finally content. Content in my abilities, content that, at least in this way, Samantha had not disappointed me. And, for the first time in my life, I was content to simply exist in the moment. This, I thought through a haze of fragrant steam and sensual savor, is surely what awaits me in heaven. I lingered in the experience, high on my ambrosial masterpiece, and free of the burden of thought until long after the dishes were cleared and I found myself in the drawing room, basking in the afterglow of my peerless meal and sipping my favorite dessert, brandy, my own mixture, of course. It was here, at last, that I allowed myself to begin mulling over what I could possibly do to top a meal that would have satisfied God, himself. The floor shifted above me as Samantha, no doubt humming a soothing tune, rocked her baby to sleep, and I smiled a lazy Cheshire smile. Perhaps another Mediterranean dish, I mulled, my thoughts lingering on Samantha and her babe. Yes. Something Mediterranean, with sweet grapes and tart vinegar. Something rich and tender. Something with lamb. The babe gave a brief cry above, but settled quickly in its mother's loving arms. Yes, I thought, my appetite and imagination arousing each other in the back of my mind within the sinuous coils of endless possibility. Lamb sounds just right. There are posters of a missing girl all over my city. Something about them seems off. I didn't know Amy. I had never met her. Neither had any of my friends. Still, when I saw the poster of a missing girl in the town I used to call home, a suffocating feeling befell me. The feeling you have when something is entirely and utterly wrong. You can tell inside your soul that it's not how life is supposed to be. A girl so young, simply disappearing, leaving a family in pain. It's not something that should ever happen. And when it does, it can do strange things to the ones that witness it. Parents were particularly careful with their children now. Only to school and back and none of you will walk alone. Jonah, watch your brother. I heard a mother call out to both her sons as I walked to the grocery store to get some eggs for breakfast. Those words reminded me of something. What do you call nostalgia that is only bitter and not sweet? I faintly remember that we had a similar situation during my childhood. I was 5 or maybe 6 when a kid in town went missing. I'm not even sure whether I knew that child, I assume not very well. All I know is that the time was hard on all of us. Gately had a dark shadow cast over it. We lived in fear and dread. It was around then that many families left our town for good. Their homes felt stained. The memories of that time are blurry but the emotions make up for it. When I think of that time in my life, a shiver goes down my spine. I don't think I will ever be able to shake it off. I guess it felt even more wrong due to the contrast. Gately is absolutely lovely and vivid when the terrible isn't waiting around the corner. Most people are friendly and kind. The ones that never left were prone to assure that all the ones who stayed felt safe. I believe it worked. I for once had a pretty great childhood here. There was more than enough to explore, clubs to join and events were being held regularly. Even when I went to college, I always looked forward to the times I would visit Gately. Just like now. I was looking forward to Dad's cooking and Grandma's baking. I was looking forward to seeing Maddie and Nicholas again, my childhood friends. I was definitely looking forward to the carnival that would be coming to town after I saw all the posters advertising the events. There was a big one next to the entrance of the grocery store. Although it hardly stood up, surrounded by the many faces of the same girl. Posters of a missing girl. Just like all those years ago. The picture was in black and white but her shoulder-length hair must have been of the lightest blonde. Her eyes resembled 2 black buttons staring towards the camera. She was neither smiling nor frowning. Her expression looked almost apathetic in a way. Poor girl. She was so sweet. Gosh, and so young too. My head turned towards the voice that was speaking. I wasn't used to people randomly chatting me up anymore. I guess that is a small town thing. When did she go missing? I asked the elderly woman next to me. She didn't respond to my question. Poor little Amy, I hope they find her soon, she mumbled before walking inside the grocery store. The longer I looked at the poster, the worse I started to feel. It felt like it was hurting something I didn't even know existed inside of me. Finally, I managed to look away and went inside to get the eggs. As Dad, Grandma and I sat around the kitchen table, having a late arrival breakfast for me, I was greeted by the face again. This time on a milk carton. Have you seen Amy? I didn't realize they actually printed these on milk cartons, I mumbled. What do you mean? My father asked. The missing kid. I thought these only existed in movies, I said as I held up the carton. Oh, that poor little Amy. What a horrible, horrible occurrence, my grandma chimed in. Absolutely. Such a tragedy, my father added. Did you know her? I asked. I don't believe I've ever seen her in town. Although most kids kinda look the same anyway, I guess. Both Grandma and Dad were now looking at me, their eyes filled with disgust. Such a young soul. I hope she will be found soon, Grandma mumbled, ignoring my question. Who are her parents? I asked. Yes, kids should be with their parents, Grandma said as she grabbed the milk carton. She started inspecting the picture with a look that I couldn't quite place. She was smiling but her eyes looked scared. No, I mean, who is Amy? Grandma clawed her nails inside the milk carton. With a strength I didn't know she had, she pushed so deep into the carton that it broke. Milk was splashing everywhere, even to her face. But she didn't react in any way. She simply put the carton back down and continued having breakfast. I sure hope they find the poor girl soon, she whispered. What the hell? Why, I shrieked. Dad cut me off before I could say anything else. His expression was stern. I knew that look. Grandma's mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, and we weren't supposed to confuse her. Anyway, you should go visit your friends after breakfast. Dad changed the subject. He smiled, but the milk on his face and our table were only adding to the absurdity of the situation. While my friends weren't acting as entirely odd as my family, the subject of the missing girl seemed to result in weird reactions in them as well. I was hoping to find some answers with the friends I grew up with, but I only got more questions. Neither Maddie nor Nick knew the girl. They weren't sure who her parents were either. It's weird, right? I swear, it feels the same, I said. The same as what? Maddie asked. Like 20 years ago, when the other child went missing. Was it a girl too? Maddie and Nick seemed confused. There was another missing child? Nick asked. Yeah, don't you remember? We weren't allowed to play for weeks and a bunch of people moved away. The two of them exchanged eye contact. That's strange. Are you sure you didn't make it up? Nick asked. And did they ever find the child? Not sure, I mumbled. Suddenly I felt even stranger than before. Maddie smiled. Of course, you're not sure. Because it never happened. You shouldn't be spreading rumors. We should be focusing on finding poor little Amy and that is all, Nick said. I couldn't help but laugh. What the hell, guys? They didn't say anything but Maddie started gently stroking my arm. It's okay, buddy. Horrible events as these can really screw with your mind. It will all be fine though, we only need to find Amy. I left Nick's home shortly after. In the past years, I didn't stay in touch with my friends as much as I'd wanted to over the years, but I still thought I knew them. Today they felt like absolute strangers. They were odd, just like my father and my grandma. Truly, just like everyone in Gately. It's not that I had intended on speaking about the disappearance that much, but somehow I couldn't let go of it. I felt deeply involved even though I had no idea who Amy was. I didn't have any siblings that were the same age as her or even cousins, but it still stuck with me. I presume all those pictures of her were part of the reason. Her face was everywhere. I thought there were many posters when I went outside earlier, but now it seemed as if the entire town was plastered with them now. People kept saying how terrible it was. They kept repeating that we had to find the girl. Our town seemed supportive, for sure, but nobody seemed to actually do anything. There were posters and pictures everywhere, but I didn't see anyone actually searching. What had the disappearance of Amy done to them? And who were those girls' parents? And why did nobody but I seem to remember the last kidnapping 2 decades ago? No matter who I asked, I simply wouldn't receive an answer. To the point that I even started thinking of the unspeakable. I started wondering whether the people of Gately were somehow involved in the disappearance. Maybe it was somehow connected to the fact that this town is so prosperous and nice all the time. Although, if they were doing child offerings, I suppose they wouldn't be actively hanging posters with her face everywhere. Whatever was going on, it wasn't right. The people that I felt so safe and close with, suddenly seemed exchanged. They weren't warm and kind anymore, but empty and frightening. One wrong word and they turned manic. The following days, I tried to avoid the subject of the missing girl altogether. I didn't even leave home much and stayed neutral with Dad and Grandma. I didn't see my friends much either. Until the first day of the carnival. Nick, Maddie, and I had plans to go right after Nick finished work. I wasn't as excited about it anymore after the last few days, but it felt wrong to shut myself inside the whole time I was visiting. This was my home after all. I'm not sure what I was expecting. The carnival didn't come to town often and so usually it would have been an exciting day, but as soon as we got close to the area, all of that was gone. This carnival was nothing more than a shell. The rides, the booths, the games. While all lights and music were turned on, none of them were really being operated. There were posters of the missing girl everywhere. People seemed to be walking around mindlessly. Townspeople that I recognized, like the librarian or school teachers, were there, though none of them seemed like themselves. They all had a forced smile on their face, while their eyebrows were turned into a frown. They were muttering words to themselves, the same ones they had been repeating for days. Some of them had bloodstains on them, but none of them seemed to care. When I looked over at my friends, I noticed the same stare. Did you hear about that little girl going missing? Bless her poor little soul, Maddie whispered in a voice that didn't sound like hers. Isn't it terrifying that one among us is capable of such horrors? Nick asked. I didn't say a word. I simply turned around to get home as quickly as I could. Whatever was going on at that carnival, I didn't want to witness it. Everyone had lost their minds. I ran all the way home. I had absolutely no idea what was happening to the town. The people didn't seem like themselves. And while I knew how absurd they were acting, this suffocating feeling inside of me wouldn't go away. I could only hope that somebody would find this girl soon. I took a deep breath before going inside my childhood home. I was dreading seeing Dad and Grandma the way I saw my friends. I had no idea how to deal with that. Grandma was alone. I wasn't sure whether that was a good or a bad thing. As I walked inside, I heard her rummaging through something in the living room. What's that? I carefully asked. Grandma didn't answer. She just kept sitting there, looking at pieces of paper. When I saw what she was looking at, I thought about turning around again. They were posters of Amy. But then I got closer, mostly because I was worried about Grandma, and I realized that those posters weren't entirely the same. They had different dates on them. Last seen November 11th, 1990. Last seen November 11th, 1960. Last seen November 11th, 1930. Nobody that stayed here remembered the last time. Grandma had it right in front of her but didn't seem to understand it. I couldn't blame her. I couldn't quite understand why it was affecting us like this. I just can't shake that image out of my head. The picture of Amy with those black button eyes and ash blonde hair. That poor little girl must be afraid and cold, waiting for someone to rescue her. I guess that's why I'm writing to you. We simply must find Amy. Have you seen her? I moved into this house 5 years ago. Today, I found out it had a secret basement. I'd finally got round to doing the renovations. Saving up for a mortgage deposit damn near emptied my bank. The next step was finally fixing the place up. It took me a while. Materials and labor cost a fair bit, after all. That's also why I decided to try and do as much as I could myself, even though I know nothing about DIY. Mom and Dad helped me find the house and chipped in a bit on the down payment. Maybe if I'd told them about my renovation plans instead of trying to make it a surprise, they'd have stopped me. A family friend, Hank, hooked me up. He wasn't a realtor, but he knew people and managed to convince the seller to hold off before it hit the market and got snapped up by some rich cubicle monkey from the city looking for a summer home. I didn't meet the previous owner. Didn't think to ask. I thought I'd struck gold when I took the keys, but now I'm starting to connect the dots. I never saw who used to own the place. Mom and Dad handled all the paperwork, so I just assumed that Hank had owned the place. I spent the afternoon renovating, and now I could happily let the bank keep the house and mortgage as long as they let me leave town. This was the first house I've owned, and the second I've ever called home, but I don't feel safe in either. I've lived in Alameda all my life and decided long ago I'd never move away. All that's changed. After today, I'd take living literally anywhere else, even Pyongyang or Kabul. I didn't even mean to find the door to the basement. While I was carrying my dad's sledgehammer up the stairs, I slipped and dropped the damn thing. It thudded back down the staircase and embedded itself in the wall at the bottom. The hole left when I pulled it out exposed the wall cavity within. I couldn't ignore the handrail, or the fact the wall cavity was wide enough to walk down. My curiosity got the best of me, so that's what I did, and I found the door to the basement at the end of the secret corridor. My honest first thoughts? Annoyed, but also sort of hopeful. This meant the house had more space than on the plans. If I knocked out this wall, the living room would be much bigger, adding thousands to the property value. If it had an entire basement then, well, that could potentially be a whole extra floor. I hadn't been planning to flip the house. I wanted to live in it, but the chance to add an additional floor would add so much to the listed value I might not be able to resist. The door looked like the rest of the doors in the house, albeit dusty and behind on several paint jobs. When I picked up on this fact, I also realized the back wall of the wall cavity was the same blue and white striped wallpaper I'd found hidden underneath the stucco panels I'd removed from the living room. This meant the new wall had been installed long after the house was built. I was only down there for 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, every positive thought I've had about the house turned to dust, and I felt the need to burn the house down immediately. On my descent down the basement steps, I walked calmly, but coming back up them I was sprinting and screaming. The smell hit as soon as I opened the door. Dank, musty, a hint of sweetness to it that suggested mold or rot. It didn't perturb me. I just figured nobody had been down there in years. Maybe a raccoon got in and died. I wish that could have been the case. Turns out it was far worse. The last not terrified emotion I had today was the mild relief when my prying fingers found a switch on the cold wall in the dark. As soon as the basement was flooded with light from the grimy bulb, I yelled. Not in fear at first, just in surprise. I didn't expect the room to be furnished. I don't know what I'd expected in the 200 square feet secret floor of my home, but it wasn't a rickety table with a small electric grill and chipped dinner plate. It wasn't a cooler in one corner with a dark red liquid overflowing in a trickle down one side. It definitely wasn't a small TV displaying a static lace CRT rendition of the local news. When I saw the beat up TV, my gaze drifted to the wall behind it. I made another noise then, a kind of half yelp, half moan. This time it was out of fear, but not the full-on heart palpitation causing horror I'd feel by the time I'd reached the top of the stairs again. There were several hatches on the basement ceiling, complete with ladders that presumably lead to other wall cavities around my home. That's how whoever lived down here got around the house. Then I saw the photos. There were dozens of them pinned all over the walls. Polaroids, all of them half blurred and bordered by the black of the wall or ceiling around the holes, each a peep shot through one of the many voyeur ports hidden in my house. Every picture was of me. Sleeping, eating, showering, pooping, even pictures of me and Allison doing it during our brief relationship. I started yelling when I noticed just how far back in my timeline these pictures went. The ones on the wall behind the bed were from when I moved in 5 years ago. Then I turned around to look at the ones directly behind me, and saw straight away that even though they were through peepholes, they weren't taken in my house. They were taken in my parents' house, the one I grew up in. The most recent photo I saw was of me moving tools into the living room. The oldest was of me when I was about 5. When I saw that one, of me sitting by the Christmas tree opening the Nintendo 64, a photo I'd seen so many times but from the angle of Mom's camera on the couch, I started screaming for real. My high-pitched shrieks coincided with the moment the bed started squeaking. I hadn't paid much attention to the bed after turning on the light. The Polaroid collage on the wall of my entire life took up most of my focus. I did notice the bed when the mattress creaked though. Something was moving underneath the gray, stained, moth-eaten blankets. My screams doubled in volume when the thing in the writhing folds sat up. By the time it turned toward me and spoke, I could feel the warmth of piss rivering down my inner left thigh. "What are you doing in my room, little brother?" I've never run so fast in my life. I didn't catch too good of a look at it. My fight or flight response kicked in pretty much the moment I heard the first raspy, crackling syllable. The hunched, rakish figure I managed to glimpse before hurtling myself back up the stairs was waxy, yellowish, and all bones with little muscle. The little hair he had on his lumpy scalp was thin, patchy, the kind of hair usually seen on those undergoing early chemotherapy or nuclear fallout exposure. The smell got worse when it spoke, wafting out its rotting throat from between chipped, blackened teeth. The eyes? From my short look into them, I remember small, shriveled things, puckered reddish orbs harboring wall-angled pinpoint pupils. None of that is why I physically can't bring myself to think too much about the thing living in its own filth under my house all these years, though. It's not even the photos, although speculating about those too long to start an onset of panic attack spiraling. The reason I got in my car this morning and haven't stopped driving until I pulled over 13 hours later to write this, is that something in that yellow, waxen, pustular face was harrowingly familiar. I tried calling Mom, Dad, and Hank dozens of times on the road. None of the three picked up, but that was my fault. I shouldn't have left those ranting half-crazed voicemails after the first calls weren't answered. They're probably making arrangements right now, covering all this up again. I've got so many questions. Problem is, if I want to get answers I'll have to head back into town. Back to where that man, no, that thing that was living in my basement is. I don't know if I can bring myself to go back there, but I have to know. Why did it call me little brother? My husband gave his life away for a job. I did not, so why is it following me? I love my husband. I know he kept secrets. Every marriage has them. You can either recognize it and move on, or lie to yourselves like all the other self-medicated idiots with an 4 full of housewives and a drum full of honey-fried chicken wings. Nevertheless, a friend of mine once opined that outright deception in a relationship is like lying to your left lung. Some people can breathe that way just fine all their lives. Others can't. I knew for sure from a young age that I never could be that type of girl. The type that nodded and smiled sweetly and said things that didn't make any sense. That just wasn't me. One morning, John woke up sick. He tried to hide it from me, but the creaking floorboards couldn't conceal his clumsy footsteps, and the thin walls did nothing to mask his cat-like retches. I laid awake for a while listening to him cough and gag. This wasn't the first time that week. It wouldn't be the last. Something was wrong. I just couldn't comprehend what would cause him to lie about it. "Honey," I eventually called out. "Are you all right in there?" "Aha," he shouted excitedly. "Fine. Totally fine. Didn't mean to wake you up." The drone of a conference call replaced my reply. A man in monotone mumbled something undoubtedly important about numbers and critical mass. My husband whispered back. The loud light turned on over the sink and the screech of the bath followed. I couldn't hear much more. John came back out after a shower and a shave. He looked like hot death. His skin was pale. Fresh snot welled up around his nose. Nevertheless, he claimed he would still be going into the office that day. Meetings to be had, budgets to be discussed, important people here, important people there. "We have a project lined up," he insisted. "A big one. The type that can finally get us out of this old house." We had argued about the topic before. Nothing could keep my husband from an honest day's work. I typically played the slacker to his overachieving ladder climber. But this time was different. He breathed differently, as discussed, literally and figuratively. "You are going to get the whole office sick," I snapped. "Come on. Stay home. I'll take care of you." He ignored me and walked over to the closet to pull out a shirt and tie. I rushed out of bed and planted my feet in front of the dresser. He stared back at me. New lines of thin blood leaked from razor nicks on his neck. "You're not going in," I repeated. "Really? Enough is enough. You have worked yourself to the bone for this company. They can allow you a simple day of goddamn rest." He eased me aside and pulled back a drawer. "We get 10 days of vacation a year. 1 work from home day a month. I've used up all of that and it's only February. Plus my director is up my butt. My boss is up my butt. They have us testing this new material." I moved back in front of the dresser. "Ah, what's the point? You don't care. I don't care. Nobody cares. But it's work that needs to be done, and it pays well, and we don't make enough money as it is." There it was. I'm sorry. The dagger. I didn't mean anything by it. But my new thing will get us out of this hellhole. I promise. He reached for the pant drawer. "Did you know the toilet and there only flushes when you hold down the plunger?" I disappeared into the basement. I heard the door slam sometime later. I didn't get up to investigate. I was pissed. "Goodbye," he shouted. "I love you." John got home late that night, sometime after 8, as announced by his hacking coughs and relentless sneezes. I greeted him in the kitchen with some tea and cold medicine. He shrugged it aside and collapsed into a chair. Sweat leaked out from the armpits and belly of his button-down blue shirt. "No tea," he groaned. "Water. Please." I nodded and went to fetch it. He grabbed the glass and winced in pain when a little spilled on his hand. That's when I noticed the rash. Bright red blisters formed at the joint of his collarbone and shoulder. Some were popped, some not. I pulled down the fabric and saw the cut snake all the way down his arm. "Are these all new?" He nodded painfully. "I only touched it once," he whispered. "It was an accident." "They don't know. They can't. They wouldn't. If they knew I touched it, they wouldn't have let me leave. Right?" I grabbed his hand. The skin felt loose. Slow down. What did you touch? He considered the question for a second. Nothing, he muttered. I don't know. I'm fine. Clearly not, I laughed. You need to see someone. No, he sighed. I'm fine. Please. They'll know. I relented in a compromise to see a doctor in the morning. We slept in separate beds that night. I set up cooling pads in the guest room and brought in a half-dozen humidifiers. The room had an awkward sort of glow to it with all the different lights. The aromas made it feel kind of like an underground rub and tug. John traipsed in and buried himself under the covers. I kissed his forehead and it felt cool and clammy, but not feverish. I had hoped that meant the effects were subsiding. Thank you, he kissed me. This helps. Doctor tomorrow, I repeated. Doctor tomorrow, he agreed. I watched television for a little while. John fell asleep before me. The raspiness of his snore mixed in with the drone of the rain. I fell asleep to the episode of Friends where Monica gets her head stuck inside of a chicken. I woke up to a skittering in the halls. I don't know any other way to describe it. We have 2 cats. Sometimes they chase each other around in the night. This would be like that if the cats were the size of bulls. Picture frames fell down the hall. The walls buckled. The floor shook. Something enormous growled and something bigger hissed back in response. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and slammed the screen with half-open eyes. 3 in the morning. The house grew quiet. I waited hopefully for my husband to get out of bed. I assumed an animal got inside. I knew he kept a baseball bat in both closets. I wished then that we had a gun. I could hear this low sort of vibration. I reached around and felt for the source. I realized then that both cats were in bed with me. They stared back with wide eyes piteously. The house was still quiet. A loose floorboard creaked by the bathroom. Then another one in the kitchen. A door creaked open. Then silence. All of a sudden a rush of scattered footsteps sprinted for the dining room. My china cabinet fell along the way. A voice howled an oddly interpretable victory as the remains of my teetering glass figurine shattered into pieces all over the floor. I got out of bed. I am not a formidable girl. I don't have any fight experience whatsoever. I tend to be more well-versed on the flight side of things, and every instinct in my body told me to get the hell out of that house. There are no windows in my bedroom. I was on the 2nd floor. I needed to make it down the stairs and out the front door for my plan to succeed. I reached into the closet and found the backup bat for safekeeping. The floorboard outside my bedroom only creaks if it's hit dead on. I danced around the broken piece of garbage like a ballerina. I looked in the guest bed and saw my husband wasn't in it. I should have stopped there. But something urged me forward. Call that curiosity or just plain stupidity. The stairs only squeak if you rush. I took them one at a time, careful to place half my weight on the preceding one before continuing. I could hear a mashing sound from the dining room. Something was eating. Something big. It ripped and gnawed hungrily along the broken glass pieces from the cabinets. I turned the corner and wished I didn't. My husband was laid down across the floor. He was dead, as evidenced by the blood-covered wound on his neck, and the glazed look in his eyes. Something was eating him. I couldn't see the full shape of it at first. His legs pulled and ripped like a broken antelope on the savannah before his entire body flipped over in favor of the meteor backside. I held the bat over my head. My feet followed their one foot after the other routine. Time slowed to a crawl. I could hear my every breath. Then a voice completely shook my battle trance. Honey? The corpse went still as the shape behind it stood up. It was him. My husband walked over to me gracefully. Blood dripped down from his lips. He wiped at it awkwardly, like he'd just been caught snacking on ice cream. The blisters were gone. All of the sickness from the previous day seemed to be erased. He smiled and gestured smoothly at his own body on the floor. What the hell? I can explain that, he whispered. Why don't you just relax? I swung once and the bat connected with his jaw. He grimaced for a second, looked back at me, and grinned. I made a mistake, honey, he started. White Valley made it right. Good as new. New me. Can't you see? I'm fine. Really. I am completely fine. I hit him again. Honestly. We are good, he spit out a tooth. But we won't be if you keep this up. John reached for the bat and the next few moments happened in a blur. I pushed him back, he fell to the floor, and I went for the door. I found the handle and raced out into the cold before remembering my keys. I opened the door one last time and snatched them from the ring. I looked into the house one more time and noticed John wasn't chasing me. He had returned to the corpse of himself on the floor, with a long knife at the ready, tearing apart the easy bits. I did all of the things you might expect. I called the cops and asked them to check the house. He wasn't there. I had somebody go and pick up my cats. They were fine. I tried to put that night behind me as some sort of bizarre fever dream. John never tried to contact me. I never tried to contact him. I told my parents we were done. They didn't press me on why. They never really trusted him anyway. I returned to the house this morning for the first time in a long time. It felt eerie being there again. I took about an hour to pack some boxes and move stuff around for the eventual sale. I caught my reflection in the mirror towards the end of the trip. I looked haggard and exhausted. The bags under my eyes had bags. I felt sick, and I almost didn't see it, and never would have noticed, had it not been for the placement of that mirror in the bathroom. A bright red blister appeared on my neck. I watched as it popped right in front of my eyes. I found 2 more in the last hour. Something is happening. I don't want to end up like him. Please help me. My best friend Jimmy died decades ago. I wish I told his parents how. I can remember the day like it was the present. Even the tiniest details are etched deeper into my mind's eye than the most fathomless ocean trenches. It's pretty much the only memory from that time I can still picture clearly when I want to, not that I ever do. Fields of golden corn slowly danced on the Iowa summer breeze. The air was sodden with pollen and adolescent adventure, humid even by Hawkeye State standards. It was the transient time between middle school grades in which all children's worlds advance and evolve. We walked down the dirt track, mushroom clouds of dust erupted at our scuffing feet. Simon, Jimmy, and me. Friends for as many years as we had lived. This was another walk among many, on another day like any other. Little did we know this would be the last hike we would ever take together. As it was, the funeral of our camaraderie was marked only by the passing of a damp cigarette end. This sacrifice to the gods of manhood was complemented by a stolen bottle of Templeton, one that I'd never get to drink but was still reprimanded for upon my mother's discovery of it in my satchel. The reason our boots had found this particular stretch of dirt road loomed ahead. The closer we drew, the more I realized the baseless rumor I believed Jimmy fabricated was true. A steeple in the sea of shimmering corn husks. It imposed itself on the landscape, unashamedly out of place. The protruding spike was medieval in origin, an intrusion of Gothic European architecture at once both unfamiliar and discomforting to my brick and mortar knowing eyes. Standing at a diameter no greater than that of a lighthouse, the cylinder of cut stone and bone-colored slabs stretched nearly 17 feet from the moist earth. As we closed in on our target, the assuring rays of sunlight fell behind the eclipsing presence of the alien masonry. This was when the first shiver ran down my spine. I should have listened to my instincts and turned around. Unfortunately, bravado makes even the wisest man act the fool. Jimmy walked Simon and I to a wooden door on the sun-blocked side of the silo. A soggy affair, dampened by the rain despite us having had several drought-filled months. Jimmy stopped to check that we weren't being cowards. Both Simon and I puffed out our chests to assure him we weren't, even though I'm sure inside Simon's stomach was turning itself in knots just the same as mine. Once he was satisfied, Jimmy pushed the rickety entranceway. Ancient hinges started to creak and summer receded as our trio stared into the room on the other side. Jimmy had said it was haunted, and had informed us so with the casual coolness associated with the alpha males of beta male friendship groups. This suave indifference became lost as he fell back in line with his fear-stricken comrades. I can't remember who took the first step across the threshold. There are a few details of that day that evade me, but who placed the foot that sealed our fate is one of them. The worst nightmares I have had about poor Jimmy over the years have been the ones where it was me. A shiver ran down my back, starting at the base of my skull and shuddering down my spine until it reached my legs, tensing them ready to run. Inside the ice-cold interior was one feature and one feature only. It was a second door. This is where the similarities to the entryway we had passed through stopped, however. I wish I didn't remember the second door. The blood-red rectangle remains in the darkest corners of my psyche. There, the memory waits for moments it can flash to the forefront of my thoughts. These moments are the cause of my hour-long fits of horror-filled screaming, the thing I've refused to seek help for all these years. Who would believe me anyway? The door stood free of any wall or support. Erect in the desert of off-white sand, from inside the tower it beckoned us towards it. The nauseating vice grip of its inhuman words on my young mind is something I wouldn't wish on even the most sadistic of men. It whispered to us not with sound, but with thoughts and suggestions. A pulling both physical and mental that wrapped us in its tendrils and yanked us closer. Wavering pink light from an unknown source glistened on the splintering crimson wood. The whispering doorway was coated in something, so thin that I almost didn't notice. I only noticed it because of the smell. It shot straight past the lungs and settled in the deepest marrow of my bones. A sweet scent, dripping with undertones of erosive aniseed. Of course, the door had a handle, a cast iron lump that strong-armed my gaze into fixating on its cryptic design. The gut-turning pink glow shone brightly on the polished surface of the knob. Whoever had carved that doorknob must have seen hell. I can't relate to you exactly what the designs etched, scraped, and sculpted onto its gleaming surface portrayed, because I honestly did not understand them. I still don't. In my darker moments, I have pored over my memories of those designs, sketched them out even, trying to find some meaning in them. A spiral of pictograms too complex for the Homo sapien mind to comprehend unfurled across the metal orb. Symbols and writing carved in inch-deep chasms, each filling me with more gut-wrenching dread than the last. I couldn't look away though. The sound of sobbing from Simon and shallow breaths from Jimmy confirmed for me that they couldn't either. The inhabitants of the underworld on the cast iron abomination had us all ensnared. They fed off of our reluctant attention, growing in their maddening complexity with every trembling teenage step. The beings in the doorknob begged us to enter, promising us things I refused to remember for their depravity genuinely disgusts me. What disturbs me most though is that I do remember how I nearly caved. At that moment, part of me wanted those foul promises fulfilled, even though my young mind understood almost none of them. It could have been me. Jimmy was the one who cracked though. I wish I could have stopped him. I was supposed to be his best friend after all, as much as we kept this fact a secret from Simon. It is a sad play of fate that I was as entranced by that mind-rending siren song as the trembling hand that wrapped firmly around the doorknob. The door did not creak when it was opened. It made no sound whatsoever, disturbing not a single molecule in the atmosphere. Grains of dirty cream sand remained still as crematorium ashes. With one fluid non-motion, the shifting ruby surface was open. I know for a fact that it was Jimmy that took the first step this time. I know this because it was he, and not myself or Simon, that the demonic doorway slammed shut on. I only caught a small glimpse of what lay on the other side. I can't tell you what I managed to see over Jimmy's shoulder. Not because I have forgotten. Bringing that memory to my mind to relay it would destroy what mental wherewithal I have left. I can't allow myself to drudge up the sounds of all those people screaming. The smell of rancid meat and abandoned gas station, whenever I make the mistake of reminiscing on it, makes resisting cleaning my nose out with bleach genuinely difficult. Reliving those screaming trees made of flesh, those mountain-sized organic tripods stalking the horizon, those endless plains of dark red earth that twitched and heaved underfoot, would destroy me. I may be bound for an old folks' home, but that is 100 times better than an insane asylum. I also can't tell you how long Simon and I stood in horrified silence. I can't tell you because I don't know. In my mind, it felt like an eternity. Since Simon's hanged body was found in a tree only 5 hours after we left the safety of my house, in reality, it could not have been longer than about 15 minutes. The abominations on the handle had disappeared, the handle itself melting in front of our panicked eyes. The leering bloodwood had prevented us from saving Jimmy. It is to my shame that what I had seen within made any hope of saving him impossible anyway. It needn't have bothered. No, I'm being harsh on myself. I was just a kid. An innocent kid. Exactly like Jimmy had been. Simon started wailing as soon as the door reopened. The only saving grace was that what I had seen on the other side was now gone. All it had left in its wake was a barren wasteland, a decaying plateau of rotting charcoal appendages and mountainous three-legged corpses on the horizon. Compared to what had occupied the space a quarter of an hour ago, the thousands of human bodies did not faze me. By this point, my battered psyche did not flinch at the sight of the decaying figures piled in a great pyramid in the distance. This monument to stagnation and cosmic futility stood taller than the largest of the now dead tripods. Even from this distance, I could see the throne at its peak. Its occupant was, thankfully, masked by clouds and the limitations of my eyesight. I don't think I would still be here today if I had seen them up close. The tortured stumbling of the old man through the doorway saved me from having to look at that figure atop their corpse throne lawn. The moment his gnarled feet crossed the threshold, the door sealed itself. The bloodwood erupted into a green flame. The pink light died, leaving Simon and I alone in the shadowy cylinder with the man from the world beyond. I remember that he was unspeakably light as we dragged him to the warmth of the Iowan summer outside the tower. We gave him some of the Templeton. We didn't know what else to do. His charred form was haunting. He was thinner than any man should be able to be. Outlines of shrink-wrapped organs protruded from his abdomen with nauseating clarity. He slurped the foul liquid through lipless teeth, the stolen bottle clasped in long, webbed claws. His translucent skin of impossible age was scarred with a patchwork of symbols, unholy brands reminiscent of the etchings in the doorknob. The seared lines in sagging flesh contorted and writhed as I watched. They moved and shifted across the decaying man's ghoulish limbs, scriptures written in otherworldly tongues that inspired only lunacy in the eyes of mortal beholders. A small part of me wishes that I could describe them to you in detail. I hate that this part of me exists. I used to draw them whilst I slept, you know. It's why my folks said I couldn't keep a diary when I was a teenager. I showed one of the therapists once. She disappeared about a week later. I'm glad they burned the drawings. Long matted hair covered the old man's gnarled features. This is why I didn't realize the slavering wretch from the terror beyond the threshold was Jimmy until it looked me directly in the eyes. Sometimes I try to guess how long he must have been there. Not often though. I don't like to ponder on the torture that a measurable time frame was filled with. The terror in the eyes I clearly recognized as Jimmy's was enough to let me know my mind could not withstand such things. I can still remember his rotting lipless gums, the smell of decomposing flesh on the noxious breath that funneled down his yellow tongue. The creature that was once Jimmy stood to whisper one last piece of advice before sprinting off into the cornfield. It has never re-emerged. The papers and police incorrectly hypothesized that Simon had killed Jimmy and hidden his remains. Simon's reasoning for killing himself was attributed to guilt. As the sole survivor, I was apprehended, and when this tale was retold labeled as traumatized. I'm not proud of the fact that I never corrected them. Let's be honest, if I'd pushed the matter, traumatized could have quickly turned into schizophrenic, and from there guilty was only a few steps away. I may have had my world ended, but I didn't want to do all the crying and trying to piece together what happened in prison. Besides, it'll surprise none of you to know that I went looking for the tower, and for Jimmy, several times over the years. Suffice to say I found neither again. So I went about my life. Now I'm here decades later, retelling the only story I've never told, hoping a bunch of strangers on the web will listen. I'm hoping doing this will bring me some kind of end to the nightmares. If I've only got a decade or two left in me, I'd like to be able to get at least one decent night's sleep before I go. The thing that keeps me up, the thing that makes me wake up half an hour after falling asleep every night like clockwork, is what Jimmy whispered to me before he disappeared into the corn. I've been where you'll go when you die, and the man in charge is angry with us. My son has been receiving strange homework from his teacher. His last assignment was nothing short of horrifying. I recently had to move to another city due to work. My family and I, which consists of me, my wife and my 9-year-old son, Dylan, were suddenly uprooted from our quiet life and had to move to a busier city, which none of us were used to. My wife had to find another job in the city and my son had to leave friends behind and start at a new school, which I hoped would all be worth it for the sizable pay rise that I was receiving. We have been moving into our new house for about a month now and everyone seems to be adjusting to the new lifestyle that we now have. My wife has found a new job, which she enjoys, and she has made a number of new friends there. My son has also settled in well to the new school. He is in the 3rd grade and, due to being in a busier city, is in a larger class than he is used to. I don't think he minds though. He has already made a few friends that have helped him adjust to the new school. His teacher, Mrs. Wagner, was a younger woman, around 30, who Dylan seemed to really like. He would always come home and tell me and my wife all about the fun he had at school and the fun lessons that Mrs. Wagner would teach. I had only met her once, when I dropped Dylan off at school on the first day, and as far as I could tell, she was a very nice lady. Every night, Dylan would come home with different homework that he would have to complete before school the next day. I'm not a massive fan of homework, but it seemed like the homework that Mrs. Wagner always set was quite simple tasks that could easily be completed in a night. One night, Dylan had to ask a parent to find out what their parents did for work and ask 3 questions about their job, and another night he had to research their favorite animal and find out 3 interesting things about it. It was always simple tasks like that, or it was simple worksheets that Dylan could complete in half an hour or so. Every night, I would ask Dylan what his homework was for that night, and then I would help him with it if he needed help. That's when I noticed the homework becoming a little bit strange. One night, in Dylan's 3rd week of being in the new class, he came home, looking upset. I asked him, when he entered the kitchen, what was wrong, and he told me that everything was okay. I then asked him what his homework was for that night, and he told me that he didn't have any for that night. This was surprising because he had some sort of homework task every single night he had been in Mrs. Wagner's class, so it was strange that he suddenly didn't. Dylan then left the kitchen and went into his room, shutting the door behind himself. He didn't usually close the door, but I thought that he must have wanted some privacy. I could tell, though, that something was wrong, but he didn't want to tell me. Dylan spent most of the night in his room, apart from dinner time, when me and my wife told him he had to sit at the dinner table with us. He seemed to be in a better mood during dinner and was fairly talkative and making jokes, like he normally did. After dinner though, he went back to his room and closed the door. We decided to let him stay there for a while, but after an hour or two, I went in to see him and let him know that it was time to go to bed. I walked down to his room, opened the door, and when I looked inside, I saw that he had already fallen asleep over his workbook. I quietly walked over to him to gently wake him up and move him to his bed, but that's when I saw it. The homework task that was set for that night. The title that was written in Dylan's workbook was "Would I Miss My Parents If I No Longer Lived With Them?" At first I was taken aback. This was a very weird task to set for a group of 9 and 10-year-olds. I didn't really know how to react to this. I continued to read, though, to see what else he had written. He had written, "I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love them both a lot and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them. But I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to, like you were saying today, Mrs. Wagner." When I read the final sentence, I felt chills down my spine. I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to. The word struck me like a brick to the face. What had Mrs. Wagner been telling my son? What was the purpose of telling him these things? I decided, probably stupidly, not to tell my wife about what I had found. She would worry, and she probably had a right to worry, but I didn't want to concern her. I decided that I would instead confront Mrs. Wagner tomorrow and ask her about this strange homework task. The next day, I took Dylan to school like I normally do, except this time I got out and walked up to the classroom with him. I saw Mrs. Wagner, alone in the classroom, as I entered the room, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hey, how are you?" she said as I entered the classroom. "How is Dylan settling in?" I answered that he was settling in well, but I did have 1 or 2 concerns. She asked what they were, and so I explained. "I was just curious about the homework you set yesterday. The one about how much they would miss their parents. I am just concerned because it is a very strange and confronting thing to ask a group of 3rd graders. I also noticed that Dylan wrote that he might have to love someone else if he had to, like you told him. I would really like you to explain that." I asked her, quite bluntly. "Oh, that," she replied as she let out a slight laugh. "Yesterday, I was teaching about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how there are also other people that would be there to help them if they needed." I wasn't satisfied with this answer and was about to question her further, when suddenly a large group of school children entered the classroom. They were all walking in 2 rows. They all greeted Mrs. Wagner and greeted her one by one. They seemed very well behaved, almost too well behaved. I then saw Dylan take a seat next to one of the students, who was staring to the front of the classroom with their arms crossed. At the entrance of the rest of the class, Dylan's behavior seemed to change. He seemed to sit up a bit straighter and his eyes widened as he began staring at the rest of the class. I looked around and noticed that all of the students were staring at the same spot. All their eyes were pointed at Mrs. Wagner. Something didn't feel right, but I knew that Dylan needed to stay at school, and this was probably some sort of morning routine they had. I left, still with concerns about the homework, but I decided to wait and see if any other strange homework would be said, before I would take this matter further. I decided that I would pick Dylan up from school, though, and so I left work a little bit early and drove over to the school. The school bell rang and soon all of the students were dismissed and starting to come out of the school gate. Most of the kids came running and screaming out of the gate, apart from Mrs. Wagner's class. They all walked out in a line, walking in time. This disturbed me. I had never seen a group of students so well behaved, especially even after the school bell had rung. Dylan walked over to the car and hopped in. He didn't say anything and sat in his seat, staring straight forward. I asked him if he was okay, and he just replied with the word yes. I drove him home, in silence, and when we got home and inside, Dylan went straight to his room and closed the door. I knew something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what. I decided to leave him alone until my wife got home and I would tell her everything that had been going on. She got home about half an hour later and I sat her down and explained everything that had been going on. She sat and listened and started to look more and more worried with every word I said. "Maybe I should go and talk to him, he might like that," she said once I had finished explaining everything. I agreed, and so she went into his room and I waited out in the lounge room for them to finish talking to each other. 15 minutes later, Dylan walked out of his room and into the lounge room. He was holding a small workbook and he said, "Can you help me with my homework, Dad?" "Of course, come and show me what you need help with," I replied. He held out the notebook and I took it out of his hands and read the homework task for tonight. Written on the top line of the page was one task. Research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic. I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt a sharp pain in my neck, and I looked down and saw the needle sticking out of the side of my neck. Dylan was holding the other end of the needle, a blank stare on his face. Everything started to go black, and the last thing I remember seeing is Dylan staring down at me as I lay on the floor. I don't know how long I was out, but I was awoken by my wife screaming and crying. I woke up, startled, as she continued to scream. "He's gone. Dylan's gone," she kept screaming. I looked up at her, and the first thing I saw was the small pin prick that was on the side of her neck. She had been injected too. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to find my son. I tried my best to get up, but I think the drug hadn't properly worn off yet because I still couldn't move properly. I could move my arms, so I managed to get my phone out of my pocket and dial the police. I explained to them what had happened, and they said that they would send officers out and would begin looking for Dylan. I then noticed that it was already 9 in the morning, and so I decided to ring the school and see if Dylan had gone there. I dialed, and a lady answered the phone. I asked if she had seen Dylan from Mrs. Wagner's class. "No, I am very sorry, but we haven't seen him today. In fact, we haven't seen anyone from Mrs. Wagner's class today, they are all absent." "Which is very odd because Mrs. Wagner hasn't shown up for work either today," the lady on the phone said. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment. My wife had heard what the lady said, so she also just sat there in total silence. That was all 3 weeks ago, and Dylan is still missing, along with Mrs. Wagner and the rest of his classmates. All the parents of the kids in Dylan's class have the same story. They were injected with something by their own children, and when they woke up, their child was gone.